On this week's episode of the Autohaus podcast, this car from 2003 is the same car you're autocrossing in now. Is that the same car?
Yeah,
Oh
it's the same car.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
No kidding.
Yeah, so it's like...
This is the Autohaus podcast. This will be our first interview officially over the phone. Could you say your name and then give yourself a short introduction?
Hi, my name is Max Pham, and I'm a Corolla owner out in Honolulu, Hawaii.
So first of all, Max, thank you so much for your time, for being on the podcast, allowing me to have this privilege. The first place I found you was actually on Instagram, and I saw this Corolla hatch, and there was like a split screen on an autocross course, and I was like, wow, this guy's footwork is amazing.
Thanks for that. I mean, I guess on my Instagram, like my Corolla, well, one, it's a 1985 Corolla GTS. I've had it for a little while, like nearly 2 decades now, but it's definitely more tuned toward autocross. And I think when you probably saw the videos were actually meant to keep myself honest. So there were a lot of things that I was doing wrong when it came to driving the car. So definitely the footwork thing, the steering thing, and just about everything else. But I've been trying to figure out how to drive it properly, especially for time trials on the small parking lot that we have in Hawaii.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
No.
I don't think the footwork is anything to be proud of, actually.
There's actually not a lot of autocross opportunities out here in the Bay Area. There's a lot of full track opportunities, which is, I think it's opposite in Hawaii, right? To my knowledge, there's no big tracks in Hawaii. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, it's different because from the different islands out here, I live in Oahu, which is the island that has the most population, roughly about 1 million people, about 800,000 registered cars. But I want to say that if, just to give you a sense of scope scale, Oahu is very similar to the Oakland, San Francisco Bay Area, just near where the Pacific touches, and that's about it. I mean, it's not much land. So when it comes to track, we had a racetrack. I think it was called Hawaii Raceway Park, and that actually closed down in 2006. So there's not that many opportunities to go do sanctioned driving, and I think that there's other racing opportunities out in the Bay Area. There's a guy that I follow. His name's he goes by Frost Vectrum, I think, and he does autocrossing with Corolla too. So there's other things. You guys have a lot of tracks out there, which makes us people in Hawaii rather jealous.
Oh yeah, let's see. I have a few people from Hawaii, including yourself, that follow my podcast. Which, first of all, thank you so much. Mm-hmm. I know you've been following me for a long time, and they say that even regular driving roads, just the space limitation of Hawaii, there's not even a lot of roads to do a Sunday drive on.
Yeah, that's a true story. Definitely can attest to that. The thing that makes it kind of really tough is just the way that they do infrastructure out here. The closer you live in the city, which Honolulu is considered the city, the lanes on the freeway, that's the number one thing that people don't really understand, is there's not that much width when it comes to it. So I think ours are the DOT minimum of 8.5 or 9 feet wide. So I have a lot of coworkers who bring big trucks out here, and when it comes to driving in the city, even the the freeway like that surrounds the city. It's not that wide. It's like they end up having to sell those bigger trucks and getting like really small cars. So like Toyota Camry, like a new Camry, that's like actually fairly like big for parking and stuff like that. And in Hawaii, it's kind of small. It's kind of similar to how Japan has their K car culture, and Hawaii, Honolulu has like just limitations in space. So we, by default, most of the people kind of just naturally go for the smaller cars. So even with the roads, like when people come in with bigger cars, they go through the roads pretty quickly.
Oh,
So it's kind of a shame. I mean, I've lived out in Washington State, and the roads out there I think are the best, most well maintained roads. But and in California, definitely your DOT is like by far more superior than out here. They're just like quicker about like making sure that the road is good and safe. But it feels like there's all these pothole alerts, so you can check it out on like all these maps where people are just like putting potholes on the freeways and streets.
oh man.
It's pretty terrible.
So, how did you get your start into Corolla?
Oh man. So it, it was partially like my parents had a little role into it, but I bought my Corolla back in 2003. I was in the military at that time, stationed out in New York, and I was going through nuclear engineering school there, and I guess I was going to be there for a little while, so I decided. Back then, I had a Toyota Camry, like a '95 Camry, and I decided that I needed kind of like a daily driver type car. And I had a friend that I went to school with out in UC Riverside, California, and he was kind of like my car enthusiast friend, and so I told him like my qualifications for like a daily driver. I wanted it to be like less than $2,000, dependable, reliable. If it can be a Toyota, because my family has always been in Toyotas, and like stick shift, because I didn't know how to drive a stick shift. So he kind of like searched online and found this '85 Corolla, and it was near where I was stationed out there, and so I drove one weekend and picked it up, and it was just it was a weird story, because it's like here I am buying like this 15, 20-year-old car, and it was good. They had like rust spots on the lift back and on the quarter panel fenders on small portions of it. But for the most part, it was pretty well maintained. But the battery died, so the owner just said, "Hey, you need to put another battery in it to pick it up. Wouldn't recommend you driving it, but you can tow it." So a friend of mine in the military kind of picked it up and brought it home. And I did not know anything about fixing cars or even any wrenching. It was just going to be my daily commuter, and it was going to be the car that I learned how to drive stick in. So the first thing that happened was like one like random things start dying out. Like the first thing was the water pump. Had it serviced at the local station or gas station auto mechanic. The car cost $1,000 when I bought it, but the auto mechanic charged me, I want to say like $800 for it. So I was like, I'm buying this car for
Oh man.
$1,000, and now I'm $800 in. It's like pretty much the price of the car just for like a small component.
Yeah.
So I guess something clicked in me where I kind of said, I think I'm an okay, like above average kind of guy. I'm going to learn nuclear engineering. I have a comp sci background. I think I can try to figure out how to fix this car myself. And so I kind of started doing DIY type stuff. That was when I realized that there was kind of like a little culture around it. Learned about Club 4AG, and started like posting there and like reading tutorials on how to fix small things from alternators to spark plugs and all this other stuff. And then there was like hachiroku.net, which I guess was more of a Pac Northwest thing. But it kind of like went through the spiraling slope of like, oh wow, like once you start learning how to fix like your water pump or change your spark plugs, you begin to think that like you can fix anything. Like you're all beefed up for it. So I felt kind of attached to the car a little bit, but the thing that kept me in the Corolla game was actually my next duty station was from New York to Hawaii. So I guess I was young and foolish, but I had another friend who was getting stationed in Washington State, and so we decided to do what two young guys do at the time, which was a cross-country road trip from upstate New York all the way through to Washington State. We're going to do kind of like a mini caravan. I think he had a Ford Focus, and I had this 85 Corolla. And me, at that time, I didn't have any attachment really to the car, but I kind of said, plan B is like, if I don't make it or you don't make it, then we'll just like jump in your car, and I'll just like try to figure out how to get rid of the other car. So, like we went all the way across, and surprisingly, like going on a long distance road trip definitely bonded me a little bit more with the car. Like we went through Niagara, Chicago, like Niagara on the Canadian side. Chicago. We went through South Dakota and Montana to the Tri-Cities area in Washington State. And the only problem that my Corolla had was like the belt started squeaking right around Montana. So I stopped by this service station, and it was like right before closing. And the guy looked at my plates and said, "You got New York plates. What are you doing here?" I guess he noticed my haircut and said, "Fix my car." It was just tightening the tensioner, but like he did it like 5-10 minutes, and he heard the story of like cross country road tripping, and he's like, "No, it's for free." I was like, "Oh wow, sure, like at least I can buy you something." But like he just like closed off. So it was kind of cool that the car shared a lot of different stories with me. So dropped off my friend in Washington State. Then I made the trip from Seattle, Washington to Long Beach, California, where it kind of got like a refresh tune up and its first paint job before I kind of showed it to my parents who lived in Southern California. And like I shipped it out to Hawaii. So I guess I'm more into it from like an intrinsic value kind of thing, and just like a DIY. It's like a good foundation for starting on wrenching.
So
that's a long story.
No. I mean, I totally love stories like that. So it's GTS hatchback.
Mm-hmm.
This car from 2003 is the same car you're autocrossing in now. Is that the same car?
Yeah.
Oh
it's the same car.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
No kidding.
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, all this emotional attachment to it. I mean, when I went to Southern California, like I knew that it was like, hey, this car has been like in areas that they salt the roads, and so I saw rust on the hatch, and so that hatch needed to be replaced. But thankfully, it didn't go to like the normal areas, so I guess they kind of maintained that. The fenders needed to be cut, and the body shop that did it in Southern California used a coupe rear quarter, and they kind of did a lot of welding and like fit it. So I actually have coupe rear fenders on the car. Yeah, and they kind of checked up on everything. They didn't they didn't do much as far as mechanical work because they were a body shop, but they because it was already pretty drivable. I think it had 170,000 miles at the time, so it was surprisingly a really, really reliable car, and that was a stock 4AG 16 valve that has been on there for the life of the chassis. So I was like, my parents were definitely true deep blue Toyota fans, and so like this car was like one of those introductions where like, oh my God, this is like an old car, but it's actually reliable. It starts getting unreliable once you start modding it up and adding a lot more custom parts if you don't really check the balance, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, you
mhm.
definitely know.
I totally agree. I mean, a clear indicator is like a lot of the work I do now to these cars is just maintenance and restoration. Right now, it's actually very little modification, and I think, like you said, a lot of people who have owned these cars or know about these cars realize that, yeah, once you, I mean, they're at that point where you want to keep them as least modified as possible, right?
Yeah, I mean it's it's a testament to engineering back in the 80s and 90s even for Toyota. Like I'm definitely more of a generational fan, and when it comes to and I guess this kind of goes back to my roots as like an engineer, is that there are certain nuances about a car or even like a country that produces cars that you kind of like understand and know. Where like there's a strong difference between European like manufactured cars, Japanese manufactured cars, and American manufactured cars, and a lot of it kind of transcends down to the engineering. And for Toyota, I want to say that they're fairly consistent about how they like over-engineer certain things and try to go for that reliability. I think it was once explained as durability, reliability, and there was like another factor that they like really do for a design criteria on their engineering, and it definitely shows. Once you start changing things on it, then you notice things break. And I guess that was why I started doing autocross. Was like I've done like kind of subtle modifications to my Corolla over the years, and I never really like had an opportunity to see if the modifications work. You know, like for example, the Andretti Type S 32-way adjustable suspension setup. Yeah, it's 32-way adjustable, but like, what does it mean as far as translating to power? How does it improve my autocross times? And trying to understand that better and trying to understand everything else kind of fits in. So that's really what I like about Toyotas.
Yeah, definitely. Since you've owned this same Corolla for so long, can we kind of go? I want to see the lifespan, how you've seen the cars and the cultures change. Maybe we'll go like by every 5 years. So like starting in
Oh wow.
yeah, so like starting in '03, like what were these cars to people?
Um, well, back at that time, I think one well, initial D started kind of like popping up, and I guess at that time, like it was definitely ingrained with the car, but drifting and Kaiichi definitely kind of like went in there as far as like making that car a little bit more popular. The price range of the cars definitely like went up over the years, which I guess the community kind of expected. Because back then I bought my car for $1,000, but it was an East Coast car, so there's definitely a strong difference between East Coast and West Coast. But even at that same time, my friend who lived in Southern California was telling me that like, yeah, this car is like $1,000, but in Southern California it would probably cost 1,500. So the price differential between that wasn't too substantial. And plus, like rust didn't really take into effect like their, yeah. So I think that was the biggest things of the time. I mean, from a price perspective, you're probably looking at like a decent running condition 8.6. Your the coupes generally were cheaper, so roughly about like the 500 to 2,000 price mark. I want to say between 2000 to 2005. When it came to the community, I think the community was definitely more like, and this was kind of based off of the technology at the time was like a lot of it was Club 4AG. A lot of it was definitely geared toward like drifting and drift session. There was less of the time trial grip driving. It was definitely more of like a grip enthusiast car, and I think that Kaiichi Tsuchiya definitely added to the flavor of that. And yeah, I think it was like roughly the start of like when the Drift Bible and all the different series that he's done kind of took like started having this culture behind it. But for the most part, it was a culture where people had that had the Corollas were trying to make it more like performance, but like drift performance. There weren't a lot of like so-called drift missiles. I think that started between 2005 to 2010 when people started like really like using Corollas and saying that, hey, these are a dime a dozen. You can start like wrecking them and drifting them anywhere you want.
Yeah, I would agree. So 2008 is probably when I got my start into, I would say, like Club 4AG. And I would agree. It's around that era that on the forums, it was like throwaway drift missiles. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And like it was a weird time too, because I guess economically for the U.S., it was like the start of the Depression, the housing collapse. And like 2008, 2009, that like was more of like just tightening up stuff, and so it wasn't like many modifications. Forgot to mention that like around 2004, 2005, modifications. Most of the modifications came from Japan. I mean, because I think that they had a lot of publicity from all the movies and magazines that came from there that like kind of grew the like made the 86 what it is. So for the most part, the aftermarket, the only aftermarket, like I guess if you wanted to flex aftermarket, you'll get like HKS, Tomei type parts and like all Japan parts and Watanabe wheels and stuff. And so everyone was like going towards like Japan as far as an aftermarket. But yeah, 2005, 2010, I think was an interesting time for it because of the economic situation. But for the most part, it was like drifting was becoming a little bit more mainstream, a lot more popular. I think D1 actually started at the end of like 2004, 2005, if I'm not mistaken.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Katsu, yeah, that was like the defeat of like when Katsuhiro defeated like the BFD during like I forget the track, but it was a Southern California track of D1 GP.
Probably Irwindale, right?
Or Formula D.
Yeah.
Yeah, Irwindale. That's it. Yeah. Yeah, so it started getting a lot more, I guess, mainstream and accepted, and I guess the prices of the cars kind of like went up there. I want to say that they probably doubled at that time because they're like, and this is just from memory, but I think that a decent Corolla price was probably right around 3,000 to 4,000 or 5,000 range for like a decent condition one, like a real like moderately restored one.
Yeah, going back to parts. I don't know if you remember, but I have a couple. There's a couple of guys locally who have been in it for a long time, like in the 80s, right? And they tell me back in the day, you could go to the Toyota dealer and flip through the paper catalog and buy TRD parts from the dealership.
Yep.
So like.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
so do you remember those times?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I did. Like it was not only that, but like I think the biggest thing that changed back when I started kind of modifying my Corolla was like definitely the Zenki, JDM Koki and Zenki bumpers, right? Because that was one of the big substantial differences, at least visually, between a U.S. Corolla and a Japanese Corolla. And when back then, the thing that was kind of weird was like some people within Club 4AG community was trying to like hide the part numbers for the Japanese parts because they wanted to buy that inventory out because you could buy them when you go to a Toyota parts like dealer. And a lot of people actually like bought the bumper skins to the rear and front bumpers, both Koki and Zenki, like all across. So I think that those people that bought them for, I want to say like under $200,
Oh my God.
like new, like yeah, it was like incredible. The only part that was kind of a little bit harder to source back then were the bumper brackets. So you had like a lot of DIY of like, here's how you can make bumper brackets for your Koki or Zenki. And that definitely was one of those things that like I never would have expected to like balloon up. I think the prices right now are like $1,000 or so, and it's just incredible. I think when I got my Koki set, and that was I got it in like 2004, and for the front and rear like full complete Koki bumpers with the lights, that was like $800.
Man.
And with the brackets and everything, with the correct hardware. And like right now, today, like you can't get that. And like it's just surprising where everything's gone.
Yeah. I think the most wild story for parts I have. So again, one guy who's been in it a long time locally, he has a legitimate N2 wide body kit on his Corolla, and he said he bought that kit from the dealer, flipping
Oh
through the
wow,
paper catalog. Yeah.
yeah, that's incredible. I mean, like before it was like the TRD like gearing for the T50, and then the TRD like spark plugs and just like random accessories, bolt-on type stuff.
Hmm.
But I never imagined that the like N2 body kit would be available through like
The dealership, right?
service or parts. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's awesome.
Hey, so speaking of a little bit off topic, speaking about Hawaii, we have two Hawaiian natives who started a shop in the Bay Area. Brian and Chris from Toy Auto Clinic. Do you know them?
Ryan and Chris.
Yeah, Brian and
Can't
Chris.
say that I have.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I have, but that's because when I started out in Hawaii, it was like 2004, 2000. I was here in Hawaii between 2004 to 2006, so it's just a couple years. But then I moved back to Hawaii, and I've been living here since 2010.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, and during that time period, I was like really, really busy with military and work and stuff. So,
I see.
unfortunately, I can't make. Yeah, I didn't really have much time to make connections, but there's definitely a lot of Hawaii natives. Um, um, Alex Pfeiffer, for example, came from out here, and yeah, I forget the guy's name, but like there's another guy that is into Corolla and H6, but he's in Southern California.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah,
Yeah, I there used to be a Bay Area shop, Blue 808, and I know that guy was from Hawaii too. So yeah,
yep,
definitely.
yeah, 808 is the zip code or area code.
So
Yeah,
fast forward to let's say 2013. What
yep.
changed with the Corolla scene?
Oh man, uh, 2013. So like, man, roughly around the last decade, I think the biggest thing that changed, like 2013 included, would be that it became a little bit more of an image thing. Like you always had kind of like the people that were kind of like doing fan tribute, initial D tribute cars. But the thing that kind of like added to it in the last decade, I'd say, is like more people doing upgrades visually. Like so, just visual upgrades and visual tuning. So I think this kind of like goes beyond just the H6 chassis and goes to other cars where like the stands bagged and just like
Yeah.
drop suspension. Yeah, and so the H6 is definitely affected by that movement, but I think that overall it's like a good movement because it's introducing people to the Corolla. But at the same time, it's like it's kind of strange, especially if you're at like somewhat opposing trains of thoughts for how you should modify a Corolla. It definitely changed the game. Before, like 5 years earlier, it was definitely this drift missile culture where these cars are expendable, disposable. Then the stance culture kind of like made it like really, really visually appealing and like just striking, where you have like 10 degrees of negative camber in the front, and like the wheels are just like showing some poke or they're just like flush, and it made it like very visually compelling, but at the same time it like lowered the drivability of it. So
Yeah.
just like any type of modification or direction, you're going to lose something from it. Like if you do autocross like I do, I can't necessarily like have the suspension drop to like make sure that there's no gap between the wheel and the fender or the tire and the fender, but because I need that suspension travel. And I think the same is true for you. Like when you go to Laguna and you're trying to like say, okay, well, what's the optimal suspension height or settings where I need a clear corner one or corner two?
You're too
So
kind. I'm
yeah, I
actually
think that's
not that. I was gonna say you're too kind. I'm actually not that intelligent. I'm gonna say it's only just recently that I've been deeper into motorsport and motorsport companies that I've learned a lot more rapidly also. But before, like my first track days, it was kind of like, well, it looks good, and people say it's good, so it probably works, right?
yeah. Yeah, and I guess it goes toward like what you're modifying your car for, right? Like
Exactly.
that, just like you said earlier, like whereas like right now the clientele seems to be shifting to like more of a restoration slash resto mod type clientele versus like a I guess performance or stance culture. Just because of the like supply and demand of this chassis. And yeah, I think that because I do motorsports with my car now, it was more of like one autocross and time trials. That's not like bumper to bumper, wheel to wheel type driving.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about like trying to see like if you as a driver, the driver mod, can like take full advantage of the modifications. Because at the end of the day, it's almost like that Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift moment when like the guy comes in with like 1,000 horsepower car and the other guy comes in with like a 500 horsepower car. It's not so much the car, but it's the driver.
Yeah.
And and I think that theme kind of like resonated across like season one of Initial D, where it really depends on the nut behind the wheels and the nuts and bolts that are in the engine.
It's funny. Only you and Taka Aono have like I don't know, like proclaimed the real world merits of Initial D, which you guys are right, but I just find it really funny.
Well, yeah, like Taka Ono, man, like one, thank you. That's a very humbling statement to be in the same sentence as Taka. Like, I've seen him and like I watched the Privateer, the like documentary. If you're an H6 nut, definitely watch it. Um, and it's very similar because like one he kind of started from like I remember that it was a Carmen Gia and he was doing body shop type stuff. Then he went to the SW20 chassis. Then he met Moto Miwa, the founder of Club 4AG, and went into autocrossing and nationals. So it like there's certain like for the most part, Initial D is like fictional, and it's like try doing a gutter run or gutter drop technique. I forget what it's called, but like in the real world, and you're gonna definitely like damage your lower control arms and everything else. But there's certain themes in it where it still like is inspiring, and it's it's kind of like that. One, from a family perspective, it's that weird relationship between like an Asian father and an Asian son,
Yeah.
but it's also the relationship of like a kid growing up and like getting introduced to a new culture and figuring out who he is in the world. So in a way, I think it's Shuichi Shijino who wrote it, where it kind of has all these themes that are really core like Japanese, but if you're an Asian American growing up at the time, you're like, wow, this is an inspiring story. So like you kind of it resonates to me in some way. I remember watching like season 1 through what was it? What are they on? Like what 5 or 6? But it was like back in 2004, and it was kind of like inspiring. Of like, oh well, that's kind of like my car. It's like it's just a car, and it's gonna break, but it's more about the person behind the car. And yeah, I always loved it about that series, and I'm probably gonna get a lot of hate and ID type stuff, but I
No,
think
no.
it shows.
You know what? One interesting thing, thinking about it now, I'm gonna say, 15 years later, a lot of people, what they don't talk about is, like you said, the family dynamic of that story. It was only until recently that I kind of thought about, like, Bunta's a single dad and Takumi's like a kid who has to help with the family business. Like that's a pretty tough life.
Oh yeah, yeah, like making deliveries or stuff like that. I mean, like it's far fetched when it comes to like, hey, is this gonna happen? But like it's it's definitely like stuff to like say that hey, there's real struggles in life. Not everyone is born with like a Cayman account or like money in the bank to start buying cars and modding cars and having like this garage mahal like built in where they're going to inherit all these other family heirlooms or cars. But I think the theme of like not just the car company Toyota, but even the model, the Corolla, that's like Toyota's biggest brand. They've sold more Corollas than any other car, like hands down, like of any auto manufacturer. So what that means is it's a very accessible car, and like even growing up as an Asian American, it's it kind of speaks to like the ability to go up the economic ladder. I mean, from the story back to the story of Initial D, you kind of like have like this kid who's just like a high school kid delivering tofu somewhere in some like village town in Japan, and now he's competing against like this rich family of like two kids that are going to be doctors, I think, and like they have like these really high performance cars, and it's like your typical underdog story of like, hey, this can't happen. It's like more about grit and what you bring to the table and the principles that your parents give you. So like me, I'm like my father's son, I'm my mother's son. I'm a product of that, and it's more of a time to celebrate it and to kind of like grow together. And over the different seasons of Initial D, you saw like the dynamic change where it wasn't like a bad guy. Like the bad guy for season 1 were those two rich kids that like everyone kind of hated from the town, but then they turned out to be like friends and started being a team together. So it's more of like life, and I guess that's one of the things that I like about different stories. It's not a horrible story. There's like parts in there where you kind of have to push the I believe button and just like go with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, as long as you take away the things that I guess the author at the core want you to take away from, it's a great story.
No, I totally agree. Going back to
Thank you.
oh, going
yeah, I mean, like, yeah, sorry. Like, there's not that many people in the Corolla community, but like that actually, I guess it's a polarizing subject is Initial D, and like, hey, it's not an Initial D car, or like, hey, I don't like Initial D because it's making the markup of my car more or whatever. And it's just kind of weird the way that like people kind of address that elephant in the room, right? But yeah, I'm glad that you're kind of like in the more embracing of like certain points. So I
You,
appreciate that.
no, no, of course. And I think it's interesting. I would, s- I want to say 99% of the people I talk to, the Corolla owners that I talk to in real life, actually really like Initial D, but because, like you said, there's an elephant in the room about the stigma about like, oh, you bought this car because the anime. So it's like no one really wants
Yep.
to admit to it. But I've never really had anyone say like, oh no, that anime's dumb or something, you know? I've
Right.
yeah, the only thing is like I do have a couple friends who like their family grew up with Rally, so they know the Corolla from Rally, not from the anime.
Mm.
So that would be like the exception.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's definitely a chassis that's it's kind of a weird setting because like out in Hawaii, so kind of a little bit of background. I'm a director within the SCCA Hawaii Club, and so that's like for the region. And so we have autocross and rallycross, and for autocross, my Corolla is like the car that I kind of like do for the parking lot, the autocross courses. But I have a Subaru that does the rallycross, and I've always found that fascinating because when it comes to rallying, you kind of need a stiff chassis for that. And so I think, like, I've seen Corollas that are definitely well prepared for it. They have road cages and stuff, but like, it takes a lot of modification to make that car like a good rally car. Like, I've actually, it's kind of funny because I know that you have a TE72 wagon.
Yes.
I've got a TE72 liftback, and that's going to be my like race purpose rally car slash occasional autocross car. But it shares a lot of different things with the chassis between the 86 and the 72.
Yeah. What year is your
So
TE?
it's 81.
81. Okay, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So
I know the later ones are pretty much just like a four-door Corolla, but
yep.
I'm only really familiar with my station wagons, so I'm not sure what like the liftbacks or the two or four door previous like pre 83 look like the underpinnings really look like.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean the geometry from the suspension are exactly the same as the 86. The one thing that's kind of like a curiosity to it, like and this is a kind of like off like uh, kind of a thing that I learned from it. The TE72 liftback weighs less than the 86 hatchback.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and it shares. You can put the same um, solid live axle that's on a GTS or SR5 onto the TE72. It mounts in the same they're exactly identical.
Wow.
Um, yeah, I mean it's not like the difference between like doing that same suspension mod to like an RA29 Celica. Like that, you need to do like some modifications to, and they don't like exactly fit right. But
Yeah.
the TE72, I want to say that it's more of the body itself that like is visually different. But when it comes to suspension and parts underneath, like I have both cars like on my driveway, and like I'm like these are practically identical. But it might be different because like the TE72 came in like the two-door, four-door wagon, and then mine is like the two-door liftback. So it's like pretty much similar to the 86 liftback because they're both three-door.
Let's talk about your first gen Celica because I've seen it in your Instagram and
Mm.
you just picked that up as a project. What's the story behind that?
Oh man. Okay. So this is kind of interesting. I have brothers, and my mom and dad live in Southern California. But one of the things that, and right around 2012 was when my daughter, my now 8-year-old daughter. Back in 2012, I was kind of like thinking when you start reproducing and having kids, you're just like, how do I actually like pass on knowledge and pass on like good and bad experience to my kids? And I said one of the things that I think define me as a person is my like enthusiasm for cars and my ability to try to think through problems of trying to like build something and work with my hands. So it was kind of that, and also the fact that like in the future, one of my personal life goals is to have a car for every decade that I've ever lived.
Oh.
So I already have like 2 80s cars, and I have like the 70s car is going to be my daughter's car.
Mm-hmm.
But I also want to make it like as a project car. So it's going to be fully restored. I recently bought a 1UZ engine for it, and we're going to put the Lexus V8 engine into this car, and I'm going to like teach my daughter how to actually wire it up and get it running and get it to paint. And so the goal is by the time that she turns into the driving age, when she goes into high school, she's going to have a car that she worked with that's restored, decent, have parts that she can source, but it's going to be there for her. And hopefully she'll appreciate the time that she spent with me on it, and then she'll be able to pass that on almost as a family heirloom. So right now she's still trying to figure out how second grade and how everything around the world currently works. But by the time that she's ready, the parts and the car are going to be ready for her so that we can start wrenching together. So that's kind of the story between the 76 Celica. The other story is that I know that you had a 76 like Celica liftback before. That was one of your first cars. But for me, I love the first gen Celica because it's Toyota's first world car. And an interesting fact is that the 76 and 77 U.S. Celica were the only years that they came in the liftback. So in a certain degree, it becomes kind of like a little bit of a collector car if you can get a 76 and 77. And for this car, it happened, like I was like looking around like ever since my daughter was born back in 2012 to look at cars that, look into Celicas of 76, 77, but look at cars that came from California. And this car actually came from Rialto, and there's not that much rust on it. It's been in the desert. The seats need to be reupholstered, but I have plans for everything, and I'm just waiting until my daughter can start working on the car. So that's the background on the RA29.
That's really what's it called? I'm really happy for you. Then that sounds amazing that you have this like father-daughter project that you can grow together with. And yeah, that chassis definitely has a special place in my heart as well.
Yeah, I mean, what's the story behind your RA29? I've never been able to piece that out because you've referenced it like here and there, but I've never got a complete picture of it.
Okay, yeah, we can definitely talk about that. So I bought that car so I graduated high school in '08, and in '08, 88.6's Corollas were still really expensive. Like, I mean, I want like a clean GTS 5,000, right? Which was a lot for me straight out of high school. So my next option was like, okay, what's another Toyota I can get that's similar, like FR layout and then manual trans. And by chance, when I went to college for my automotive degree, I met my friend Mark, whose whole family was into classic Toyotas. And I remember at a break time in school, he was on the first gen Celica forums. And I remember peeking over his shoulder like, what is that? And he's like, it's a Celica. And I was like, what year is that? He's like, 75. And I was like, they made Toyotas in the 70s? And yeah, that's how I went down that slippery slope. And yeah, he had a 77, 75, 72. He had a 89 Mark III Turbo Supra. And so yeah, we picked up a that 76 liftback locally, and that was my first, yeah, pretty much like my first car that I purchased myself, and the car that my dad calls like the Lego because it's been through so many iterations.
So you don't currently own it anymore, right? What happened to it?
Oh, I haven't owned that car in probably like 5 years. So I made a career change, and I took a big pay cut, knowing that like down the line it would be worth it. But because I took a big pay cut, I had to get rid of all my toys. So like the Celica was the most impractical car that I had, so that was the first car to go. So that's the reason I sold it.
Hmm.
Yeah. Funny story. So in Sacramento, the co-owner of Secret Factory USA, he owns that Celica now, and it's great. Like it's got another life. It's like body's like painted and restored. It's got a turbo beams in it. It's always like nostalgic to see pictures of that car because there's like old stuff that I did, like the old Megan coilovers are still on there. Like I think the old radiator, aluminum radiator that I put, and I had like a fan shroud custom made. So it's always like nostalgic for me to still see pictures of that car now.
Oh man, that's awesome.
Yeah,
Do you see yourself ever kind of like wanting to buy another first gen Celica?
I do, but and then a question I want to ask you. So the biggest issue we have in California is our emissions inspections, and so like
Oh man,
like
okay,
like you
yeah,
said, I specifically wanted a 76 or 77 because I wanted the lift back. But that's the issue is in
yep,
California, 76 is the cutoff. So mine was the first year that
right,
we still have to do the biannual smog check.
yeah,
So I would love to have another one, but that's the thing is like the emissions thing is killing us.
yeah. I mean, the California Air Resources Board, definitely one of those things, and it's kind of like. So one of my first jobs, like back in Riverside, was working for this company called the Center for Environmental Research and Tech, and it was weird because like you can look this up and see it, but there's something called the Honda EV1, and that was like an all-electric like car that looked kind of like a really like it looked kind of similar to like a Mazda 2, like hatchback. It's not a or a Nissan Leaf. It was like really not very aesthetically pleasing, but it was fully electric. But range was an issue. But anyways, like the company or the center that I worked for then was like definitely more into alternative energy. So at the time I was like, oh yeah, this is cool. But then like later in life, it's kind of weird and interesting that I'm like, yeah, like now I'm becoming a petrol head, and I love just like hearing ITBs and hearing proper exhaust notes. And it for me, the carb standards that California had, the smog standards, it kind of became one of those things that across the industry of manufacturers they had. Back in the 90s, they had like a California edition for the car
Oh
because
yeah.
like these cars can pass emissions. But then like they started rolling out like after the millennia, like 2000 onwards, it just became like the standard for all cars that they're going to be low emissions type cars. It became kind of like more of California leading the standards, so to speak, of emissions. So like while California has emissions, what Hawaii has are like two different things that like are equally as frustrating for modders and tuners. We have something called safety inspection, which we have to do every single year with our cars to make sure that they're roadworthy. We don't have to deal with emissions because I guess one we don't have a smog issue like Southern California has. Like I grew up in Southern California for 20 years, like growing up, and Southern California, LA County is like in this valley where all the smog that is generated from cars actually kind of like stays there for a long time. And so you can see pictures online where like smog is definitely an issue. But in Hawaii, we have trade winds. We like it's an island, so everything that we produce, like we don't really see. It's kind of good and bad because like one like a million cars in Hawaii produce the same amount of smog in LA. The only difference is that in LA they can see it every single day, and like it's harmful to people that live in LA. For Hawaii, it's more of like one, it goes away, but it's more of dissipation. So globally, we're not like better off or like worse off than LA, but because of that, the laws and stuff for Hawaii are more geared toward like one, safety of vehicles. And so for Honolulu County, which is Oahu, we have annual safety. And then if you modify your car, like drop the suspension is definitely a big no-no. You have to get what's called a reconstruction like inspection. And it's just a one-time thing, but like they check your suspension, if you change out the engine, change out anything in the drivetrain, and in some cases, if you change, like have body or aero type stuff, then they want to like do that. Initially, it's initially a 40-year-old law or 40 to 50-year-old law, but it was like initially designed for catching auto thieves back in the 1970s, where people kind of like just had chop shops that like took engines from other cars and like that they stole and then put them on new cars. And so it was a way for the police to kind of crack down on that. But it kind of evolved into something completely different, to more of like, hey, let's make sure that the tuner community has more like rigorous testing. So it's kind of weird that California, like you can modify your car like suspension and stuff, as far as I know. But once you start like tweaking the intake, exhaust, and engine, like the powertrain, you have to like really do those annual like smog inspections, and they crack down on it. Hawaii doesn't have that, but then what we have is like if you start like doing stuff like getting aftermarket suspension, we crack down on it. And there's something that they call the bounce test, where you have to be on like one of your like shocks, and you have to physically move the suspension about an inch, like just by pushing down on it.
Oh,
and
wow.
It's like it's ridiculous. Where like even if you have like a new sports car, the suspension like travel for like a sports car does not like go 1 inch.
Yeah.
And it's one of those infuriating laws that we're trying to repeal. And so there's recent legislation with the city and county to try to like make sure that law kind of goes away. But, yeah, it's weird that California and Hawaii are so kind of like interlinked in a way of like car culture. So, and same thing with government and legislation for it.
Yeah, talk more about that. How has the Corolla scene been in Hawaii?
Oh man, one of the things that I love about Hawaii is like this aloha atmosphere. It's more of a family, and it, for the most part, I think we have more Corollas per capita than any other like area, like AE86 Corolla.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it kind of comes from, I've heard various different explanations, but the one that I think, the theory that I believe in the most is because, so Hawaii, Oahu kind of grew up from the Dole plantation and like more of the farming agrarian community.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the people came from Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, Vietnam, China, Japan, and like even South America, Brazil and Portugal. And so when you look at the farmers that kind of came in here and built up the infrastructure of Hawaii, and look at like the things that it bring from the culture, like it's weird because if you go to any of the Asian countries, Toyota is like a really, really big like deal out there. Same thing for South America. So I think because of that, there's definitely a love for Toyota that kind of like transcends across like all the different families and generations. So the Toyota Corolla, like when it comes to economical, like sporty cars, there's there's more of a demand signal for that. Like when it came to the 1980s, when Hawaii was still in that plantation culture. So that's why you see a lot more Corollas out here. And because we're kind of like, we have a pretty substantial Japanese population, you have a lot of people that like really look back to Japan and see the trends that are happening out there. And we try to emulate it out here as like, just because of the relationships that we've had over the years. So I want to say that the Corolla scene is fairly strong here, but the laws and stuff that we've been like having are definitely crippling the tuner community.
Doesn't that sound oddly similar to what's going on in California?
Oh, yeah, and and it's like very well. One of the things that I really liked, and like it was actually your podcast, and I think I forget the other podcast, Corolla Life podcast, where and they were talking about the Bay Area Corolla scene, and you guys actually have kind of like a little subculture thing going on there, where like people are starting to know and recognize each other, and I think that that's cool. But the difference here in Hawaii now is like there's less car cruises. Before, like back in 2004, 2005, there were quarterly meets and cruises where people actually did like on-island cruises to go to the shrimp trucks at the North Shore, go around town and go to Kaka'ako and go to like the Marine Corps base and just have like friendly drives. But like 15 years later, the roads are shitty, and the Corollas are like kind of affected by that, where all the different roles of trying to make a Corolla even like reliable enough to drive on the street, it's like you have less of that, where it becomes problematic for a Corolla driver to like drive on the streets like reasonably. And it's kind of a shame because it's just how things kind of evolved. There's like this YouTube channel, Hoonigan, right? Like there's this video where he goes to Hawaii and films like a meet, and Lance, he has like this really awesome PE27 Corolla, a Mango, and like show quality won like at least 5 different SPOCOMs, and like really restored all the way up. But then like he didn't clear a bumper or clear a curb or something, and so he had like an oil spill and stuff. And so it's like, well, one, I think, yeah, the tuner scene here is a little bit more geared toward like the meets and the shows and less about the performance. And so one of the things that like that changed between cultures is that in Hawaii it's a lot more toward like presentation, and there's not that many motorsports because of our park closure.
Are there any like regular gatherings for Corolla guys anymore, or even like classic Toyota?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm not sure if you've ever watched his videos, but Noel, he goes by Noel LOL on Instagram and YouTube. He did like a lot of different H6 builds, but there's also OSI XHI, like Old School Imports Hawaii. Tommy, he does a lot of meets, and so right now I think that those meets that he's doing with Cars and Coffee and other things, there's meets for them to gather, for us to gather really, and there's different things that we're doing in the community, like a lot of Toys for Tots, but there as far as actual venues for motorsports, that's the one thing that's really crippling Hawaii, is that we don't have any.
I was curious because we were just at Texas last month, and one thing for them is because the state is so big, it's hard to get everyone to meet together. I was curious in parallel if in Hawaii, because maybe everyone's on different islands, it's hard to get together. But
yeah, well, so kind of yes and no in a way, because when you look at Hawaii and like centers of like greater populations, you have Oahu, which has like I want to say 90% of the population, and then you have Maui and the Big Island. There's like motorsports on Maui and the Big Island, but there's not. And then there's a community starting in Kauai. For Oahu, there's definitely, I want to say probably the same distribution. 90% of the 8-6 culture is probably in Oahu. But getting people, even on like the island that we live in, which is essentially like, I want to say 40 by 40 square miles, like if you had to look at it on a grid, it's hard for us to kind of like band together, except for like the occasional August 6th event, like the Hashiroku days, where occasionally we'll be there. Yeah, but then yeah, it's weird because before, like 15 years ago, there were like, let's say, about 20 different Corollas that would join that meet and the cruise. Nowadays, like on 8-6 day, we'll probably see about half that number at best. But for the old school imports Hawaii, which kind of includes not only the Japanese tuner scene, like not only Toyota, but Honda, Nissan, and everything else, but also include the European VW scene too. So it's kind of weird and interesting because living on an island, we're somewhat isolated when everything else is concerned, and our car culture is isolated as well.
Yeah, Max, so we'll close the podcast there. Again, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for doing this. And then I definitely love to have you on again also.
Yeah, my pleasure. I mean, it's like, I love my Corolla, and I just love the type of things that you guys are creating. I mean, like I saw that you guys are like definitely ramping up as far as your video production goes with your YouTube channel and everything else. So like definitely appreciate that, like what you're doing to the community. I mean, before, back in the day, it used to be that these type of like secrets that you're doing with the T50, with like drive shafts, with pinion angles, that was like closely guarded, somewhat like secrets, but you're actually sharing them, and I just want to like support you as best as I can out here.
And I sincerely appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest drivers for me for creating media is both keeping these cars running and alive physically and then also culturally, right?
Amen to that, yes. Definitely want to see more Corolla down the road.
Yeah. Max, thank you so much for being on again, and we'll definitely have you on the podcast again.
Yeah, thank you, Ezekiel. My pleasure.